Welcome to my presentation entitled Algorithmic Exile, Gender Silences, Migrant Tongues and AI Border Machines. This presentation introduces an article that explores how artificial intelligence operates as a new kind of border machine in the context of migration. In particular, it focuses on feminicide AI chatbots, soft voice, endlessly patient assistants that reproduce the same violent hospitality we see at physical borders, where migrant women's bodies and voices are scanned, silenced, and sorted. The article uses Wordson's poem "Home" as a theoretical and poetic tool to dissect how AI systems enforce gender migration regimes and to imagine alternative, more resistant ways of interacting with these technologies. The article argues that AI does not simply support border control, it actively becomes a gender border apparatus. Feminicide chatbots mimic the caring, but ultimately controlling figure of the border host who pretends to offer safety while deciding who belongs and who must be excluded. These systems demand detailed, highly personal data to prove identity, vulnerability, and femininity, often turning complex migrant experiences into rigid categories. As a result, AI pathologizes migrant women's voices, treating them as problems to be managed rather than as subjects with rights and histories. The poet Wordsworth shares the poem "Home" works as a sharp critical paradigm in this article. The poem begins with the famous line, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark," capturing the desperation and violence that drive people to leave. The article treats these lines as a disobedient script and a kind of counter-algorithm that cuts through the satinized procedural language of AI systems. Phrases like "no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land" are read as poetic codes of refusal, insisting that migration is not a choice but a necessity under conditions of violence and neglect. The research combines three main approaches. First, it carries out a poetic close reading of Shar's "Home", paying careful attention to how each line receives the logic of documentation and proof. Second, it draws the decolonial theory and posthuman feminism, especially the work of Rosie Braidotti and Jackie Shetland, to think about how AI shapes bodies, care, and subjectivity. Third, the method uses critical prompt engineering, feeding lines from home and migrant theme prompts into AI systems such as asylum chatbots, and then analyzing the responses. These outputs are read as haunted by shared ghosts, where migrant tongues and traumas overload the machine scripts and procedure revealing glitches. AI genders migration as pathology. The study shows that AI often reduces intense and life-threatening experiences, like spending days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper, as I quote, to simple checklists of general questions. When users echo Cher's line or when their accents mark them as other, the system frequently responds with misgender empathy, neutralized language, or even errors that erase their histories. These patterns reveal colonial data silences, the absence of migrant women's embodied racialized and gender experiences in the training data. In this way, the feminist IA behaves like the mouth of a shark, devours alternative voices and expels those that do not conform to normative expectations of femininity and suffering. Shar's Home becomes more than a literary text. It turns into a counter-algorithm that exposes AI as an expulsion machine, one that filters out, commodifies, or erases migrant voices. The article proposes a practice called poetic hacking, a form of techno-feminist resistance in which poetry, refusal, and fragmentation are used to overload AI scripts. By feeding defiant accent mark and fragmentary language into these systems, users can trigger glitches that momentarily break open the machine's logic. In those moments of rupture, new possibilities for solidarity and refusal appear, where the demand for legible suffering is challenged and alternative narratives can arise. In conclusion, the article argues that algorithmic borders are deeply gender, racialized, and postcolonial. They do not neutralize migration but reinforce existing power structures, often at the expense of migrant women. Words and Shar's Home shows how poetry can function as a critical weapon against AI expulsion logic, offering a language of refusal and survival. The project calls for techno-feminism design that centers migrant women's voices, embraces poetic strategies, and allow borders to glitch so that home can persist beyond containment. The keywords that capture this intervention are algorithmic borders, migrant feminism, words and shy, poetic disruption, and gender AI. Thank you very much.